Graham Greene is one of the great Catholic authors. You may remember him from his famous triumvirate, The End of the Affair, The Power and the Glory, and The Heart of the Matter. In all three novels, he struggles with the ideas of good and evil, of morality, of God and conscience. In these three novels, Greene deals directly with God as never before. God actually becomes a character in each of the novels. He is talked to and questioned at length. Greene's Catholic novels explore situations which reveal the conflict between the rigidity of the Church's rules. If you know anything about Greene himself, his life was a litany of failures and much unhappiness. He experienced many extremes in his life, from the heights of exhilaration to the depths of depression. And we see this played out in many of his characters. Henry Scobie is the main character in The Heart of the Matter. He was not an upstanding man. He was not faithful to his wife, and he was tormented because of it. And then he commits suicide, but he tries to make it look like a heart attack so as not to burden his family. His last words were, "I love." When it becomes evident that it was a suicide and not a heart attack, Mrs. Scobie assumes that he is condemned. So she says to the parish priest, "It's no good even praying." But Father Rank sees it quite differently. He says to Henry's wife, "For goodness sake, Mrs. Scobie, don't imagine you or I know a thing about God's mercy." But Mrs. Scobie doesn't stop there. She quickly says, "But the Church says." And Father Rank responds, "I know the Church says. The Church knows all the rules, but it doesn't know what goes on in a single human heart." Well, the laborers in the gospel today grumbled against the landowner because they felt he was unfair. He was too generous to those who came at the last hour. And they were envious because he didn't live by the letter of their law. He was unfair. Well, Jesus is telling us in this gospel that the God that Jesus came to reveal is more generous than we can ever possibly imagine, and that we can never truly figure this God out. Because as we heard in the scriptures, God's ways are not our ways. If you followed any of Pope Francis's travels, you may have heard about his trip to Colombia. When he arrived in Medellin, the capital of the drug culture of the world, he was there to console the orphans and the poor and the sick. And he made a demand towards the priests and the ordinary Colombians to look beyond the rigid doctrine and to care for sinners and welcome them in. Colombia's church is quite rigid, and Francis challenged them to look beyond their rigidity and to go out and actually find sinners and minister to them. It seems to me that Francis truly does understand the message of the gospel that was just proclaimed. According to a medieval legend, the apostles assembled together in heaven to celebrate the Last Supper. There was one seat vacant until through the door Judas came in. Christ rose and kissed him and said, "We have waited for you." God's ways are certainly not our ways. How hard it is for most of us, many times, to welcome back and forgive the Judases in our lives. But Jesus tells us of a God who thinks outside of the box that we have created. Now, certainly some people do struggle to live out the message that we heard in that gospel today. Melvin Burns owns a farm in Nova Scotia. His farm has been robbed many times during the past year. $1,000 of his tools were stolen. $5,000 of his animals were taken. So he went to Facebook to offer 2 rewards. First one, if anyone comes up with a tip that leads to the recovery of his tools, he will give that person 5 pounds of his best Berkshire bacon. But then, the fact that the perpetrator took food led Burns to his second proposal. If the thief turns himself or herself in, Burns will give him a job on the farm and teach him agricultural skills. Burns's personal training will make the person more employable and bring him respect. Burns wrote, "Please, if you need money and are close to our farm, offer your labor, offer your time constructively. It can earn you money, respect, and a future in the community as opposed to being behind bars. I will offer you much for free and better things to do with your time, and that's no bull." Isn't that what the landowner did in the gospel we heard proclaimed today? I will offer you much for free. This is how Jesus describes our God. One who gifts us generously beyond all of our imagination. You see, it's truly all about grace. God's grace, not God's punishment. You see, heaven is a gift. It is not something we have to earn. We can only reject it, but it's gift and it's grace. Tip O'Neill, the late Speaker of the House of Representatives, once told a story about Henry Ford. Years ago, when Henry Ford was in Ireland, 3 priests asked him if he would give a contribution to a hospital. He visited with them and he told them that he would give $15,000. The next day, it came out in the newspaper that Henry Ford was giving $50,000. Now, the priests were very embarrassed. They went to see him. They apologized. They said, now we're going to put a new thing in the newspaper saying that you're giving $15,000. Well, Mr. Ford said no. He said, no, I'll give the other $35,000, making it $50,000, but I'll do this provided you put an inscription over one of the doors in the hospital. They said they would, and Tip O'Neill said the inscription is actually there. Henry Ford said, the inscription must be this: I was a stranger, and you took me in. The gospel today tells us of a God that we can all shout that same phrase to. I was a ghastly sinner, and you took me in. I betrayed you, and you took me in. I failed you miserably, and you took me in. I caused great scandal, and you took me in. I was divorced, and you took me in. I was gay, and you took me in. I was transgender, and you took me in. I was an immigrant, and you took me in. I was in prison, and you took me in. And as I read Graham Greene, I can always hear him saying to our God, I so totally messed up much of my life, and you took me in. So the challenge that I see in the gospel this weekend is a challenge for all of us. Let's not imagine that you or I know a thing about God's mercy, because God's ways are definitely not our ways.